Hello folks, welcome to a Crops TV episode on the science behind soil carbon credits. My name is Marshall McDaniel. I'm an assistant professor in the agronomy department at Iowa State University. And this episode I'll be talking about soil organic matter, and it's what you see in this slide here is making this soil look so dark. And why it's important in carbon markets and catching a lot of buzz these days, as you probably all know. So during this episode, I'll talk about the state of science on soil carbon. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me at marsh, M-A-R-S-H, @iastate.edu. And you can also follow the cool things my lab is doing on Twitter at soil_plant_IXNS, which just stands for interactions on Twitter. And so if, I will not answer questions during this. This is a pre-recorded video. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I encourage you all to follow our lab on Twitter too. So I'm just going to go over a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about in this episode. So I'll talk about soil carbon and markets, a little bit of intro and background on it and some terminology used with soil carbon, how we got here with our soils and how much carbon there is in it now and where can we go, so kind of the potential. And then I'm going to borrow from ex-Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, talk about the known knowns of soil carbon science, the known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And I'll talk about first conservation practices that increase SOC, or soil organic carbon is what that acronym stands for. And then I'll highlight or really hone in on two case studies from Iowa, some research from a colleague of mine, and then research going on in my own lab. And then I'll talk about some of the known unknowns or things that we should be aware of as we move forward in carbon markets and verifying that practices are increasing soil carbon and why monitoring soil organic carbon is challenging. And then something I'll get to in a moment, the idea of co-benefits and trade-offs with increasing soil organic carbon. And then I'll talk about the unknown unknowns. So these are things we really just have no inclination or idea about right now that'll really change the state of the science on soil carbon, but the carbon markets themselves. And that's really government involvement in new technologies. And then I'll just end with a quick take-home question and answer. And I'll answer these questions. Do we know enough to move ahead on carbon markets, soil carbon markets specifically, and where should the science focus? Okay, let's get started. So unless you've been living under a rock in the past few years, you've probably seen headlines like this in Successful Farming on farming carbon credits or carbon markets. And here's another headline from the Wall Street Journal. And so this is a big deal if it's both hitting the farm journals and magazines like Successful Farming, but all the way up to the pillars of journalism like the Wall Street Journal. This article is actually featuring Kelly Garrett, a farmer in Iowa, and his management practices in soil carbon. And then there's one of my favorites in Rolling Stone, which usually covers, they do cover politics, but they're more well known for covering music, also had an article recently in the last year about soil carbon markets. So this is all over the place. There's a lot of buzz. And part of the reason why I was invited here to give this, this episode. So I'm not an economist. I'm not going to go on into the economics, but I do want to point this out. There's a document by my colleague in the economics department, Alejandro Plastina, and his graduate student that was published this year on several of these voluntary programs or carbon markets. And I made this table that's kind of an adaptation of just the verification methods and some of the details on that. And I just want to point out and draw your attention to a few things. So the methods, one, how they verify or pay the credit, and it's usually based on soil sampling. So carbon markets agreed we still need to collect soil samples. Either some sampling, a model, or a combination of the two. There are some voluntary markets that just pay per practice rather than the outcome, and so no verification is needed. But many of them do need verification that soil organic carbon is changing. And then there's a little bit of information here in this table about who and how measures the soil carbon change and who actually pays for it. Some of these programs actually require the growers or farmers to pay for it, as in the case with nori, I have highlighted here. So when I talk about soil organic carbon, a little bit more context, I want to mention that it's not just soil carbon, but there are other kind of co-benefits or things that also tend to increase with soil carbon. So this is important for the context. So even though a lot of the carbon markets are tracking soil carbon, there are many other properties that kind of come along for the ride with increases in soil carbon. And in order to demonstrate this, I'll take you back to algebra class, maybe in middle school or high school, where you might have learned about the transitive properties in math. And so if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C is the example. So here, when we're talking about soil carbon, sometimes even I will use it interchangeably with soil organic matter, or you probably heard this term as well. Soil carbon is about 50% of organic matter because there's other elements in organic matter. There's hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. All of those elements are also entrained in the organic compounds that make up organic matter. Although there is a relatively fixed ratio of carbon to some of these other elements, we can roughly estimate that a change in soil organic carbon is about the same as a relative change in soil organic matter. So you'll hear me kind of switch back and forth between the two, but we are talking about two different things. Carbon is just the one element, where soil organic matter comprises all these other elements, carbon being 50% of it. And then the next kind of transitive property, increasing organic matter actually facilitates the increase in a lot of these other soil ecosystem services. So soil ecosystem services are benefits that human beings get out of soil. So water holding capacity, soil stability, nutrient storage and release for crop production, climate change mitigation, so that connects to the carbon and why we really have this momentum in a carbon market right now is the mitigating climate change, increasing carbon. So these are all functions of soils that benefit humans and arguably the rest of living organisms on planet Earth. And all of those things combined are really what you hear when you hear people talking about soil health. Soil health is the idea to enhance those soil ecosystem services so that soils are functioning and providing those benefits at a maximum capacity. And I just want to show you what some of those are in relation to this document that's from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and just explain how soil organic matter is central to all of these. So this diagram here, this kind of pinwheel of soil functions that are soil ecosystem services, are all centered around soil organic matter, which is why I kind of put it in the hub there in the center. So the main purpose of agronomy, at least in the past, has been provisioning of food, fiber, and fuel. And now we're starting to think about some of these other functions or soil ecosystem services: carbon sequestration, water purification, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, which actually feeds back into the provisioning of food, fiber, and fuel, habitat for organisms. We know the biology in the soil is really critical to how it functions. And also, lastly, flood regulation. All of those highlighted yellow ones are the ones that we care about as agronomists, but there are some other soil functions I won't go into here that maybe other professions care about. Okay, so that's a little bit of context on soil carbon markets, and now I'm going to talk about the history of where we're at now, as I mentioned in my outline slide. So I'm going to use Des Moines, the Des Moines lobe, as an example here. One, because that's where Ames is, and it's where we conduct a lot of our research here at Iowa State University. And about 10 to 14,000 years ago, the Wisconsinian glacial extent stopped at Des Moines, hence the name, why it's called the Des Moines lobe. So 10 to 14, about 14,000 years ago, that glacier extended to its maximum and then started to recede. And as it receded, soils started to be born. So that was the initiation of soils. And so now I'm going to show a graph of what has kind of changed over this time period. So on the left hand of the portion of the graph, there aren't any years because it's going back tens of thousands of years. And then I bring it up to 0, which is about at the time at which European Americans, that's what E-A stands for, started cultivating the land. So over that 10 to 14,000 years, soil organic matter was being generated mostly in a savanna and oak mosaic that also included a lot of flooded depressions. So soil organic matter was accumulated over that 10 to 14,000 years. Then we have a gap of about 3,000 to 4,000 years where there were native folks farming in Iowa. And we don't know a lot about we know a bit about their farming practices, but we don't know about their agricultural practices and effects on soil organic matter. So we think that it was minimal, but we just don't know enough to say for sure. But let's say that we're still at 100% organic matter according to that 10 to 14,000 years prior to cultivation. Then Euro-American settlers started coming into the Des Moines lobe, and due to practices like tillage, extensive cropping and not adding organic sources like manure, and soil erosion, perhaps tile drainage, all has resulted in about a 50% decrease in soil organic matter and likely coincidental loss in soil ecosystem services too. So that we're at about 50% of the soil organic matter, but also probably a 50% of capacity of those soil ecosystem services as well, although more research needs to be done on that. And then, so that, I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer here, and I want to put a positive spin on this. So I look at this as a glass is half full, and many growers in Iowa and other parts of the Midwest also look at it this way too. So if we're at present day, between 200 and 250 years since cultivation, we can look at where we're at as being a glass half full and providing a management intervention that can then regenerate soil organic matter, rebuild it, and restore soil ecosystem services. So this is what the soil health movement, this is what carbon markets are interested in, at least from the carbon angle. But what my research in my lab group and other folks are doing are trying to determine, say we implement a management intervention, how fast does soil organic matter recover? And we don't know that because there aren't very many long-term experiments. We've got some shorter-term experiments, some a little bit on the longer end I'll go over examples of in Iowa. But then the second question is, will we ever reach that original 100%? Right now, we probably don't think so, but at least it's a laudable goal to shoot for. Okay, so now to shift gears a little bit, I'm going to talk about some soil carbon jargon or technical definitions regarding these carbon markets. And there's two ways to measure soil carbon, or at least express the units in scientific literature, but also you might see this in carbon market publications. So there's something called a carbon stock. This is the mass of carbon per unit area for a given depth. So you need to know the depth you're measuring for. And I've got a cube block of soil over here on the right showing that. So at a 15 centimeter depth or 6 inches, we would be measuring how much carbon is stored in that block. And so the typical units, at least metric units, are megagrams, or that's a ton per hectare. And in order to calculate this, you need to get the concentration of carbon, which I'll talk about in a moment. You need to get the bulk density, which is the mass of soil per unit volume. And then you need to get the depth you've measured. And then the advantages of doing this is you can compare to the plant inputs. So the massive roots that might be going, or residue that might be going into that soil to create soil organic matter and soil carbon. And also you can estimate the total mass to a depth for a certain field. The disadvantages is that bulk density measurements are onerous and very error prone to measure, and there's high spatial variability. And it can be difficult to compare studies that measure at different depths, and I'll show an example of that in a few slides. But typical values for Iowa mollisols are about 100 to 250 tons or megagrams per hectare, down to about 5 feet or 1.5 meter depth. Now if we look at carbon concentration, which is actually required to calculate the carbon stock, concentration is mass of carbon per unit of dry soil. And I've got an example here, an insert showing the organic matter, which is the dark colored circles, which represent soil organic matter, are particles that are surrounded in a matrix of inorganic particles. That's the sand, silt, and clay, the materials that don't have, are not organic. And we usually represent this concentration in units of grams per kilogram, or a percentage. And the only thing required to calculate it is concentration. The advantage is it's only one measurement is needed and does not scale to an area. And there also happens to be a lot of spatial variability. In Iowa soils, we can have a range from 1.4 up to as high as 8% or more, just within the top 6 inches or so. So this is how either of those measurements are collected, kind of walking you through step by step. So this is some equipment that my postdoc and a graduate student that's currently working for me now used to collect soil samples in a recent study. It's a Giddings deep soil core that's gas powered, and it allows us to sample relatively deep, about 1.2 meters, and it's mounted on the back of our Iowa State trucks as shown here. So we can take some deep cores from this, and then we usually put these cores at different depth increments into plastic bags. We bring them back to the laboratory, we sieve out any rocks or roots, and then we let the soils air dry, and then we can grind them to a fine powder, and then analyze them usually in one of two methods. And these are the machines that we end up analyzing them on. On the left is what's called a muffle furnace, and this is a measurement of loss on ignition, sometimes called LOI, and that's to measure soil organic matter. And this is what a lot of commercial laboratories report when they give you soil organic matter. They're taking your soil and combusting it at high temperature and just measuring the mass that's lost after that combustion, and that because all of the organic matter is combusted. The machine on the right is somewhat similar in that it uses combustion. It's dry combustion, but it captures the combusted products and converts them into a elemental unit. So you get the percent carbon, you get the percent nitrogen in many cases if you've got the right setup. You get the percent hydrogen. You can adapt these to measure them for sulfur too. So this is what a lot of researchers use. Some commercial labs are now using this, especially with the interest in soil carbon. You can get soil carbon with the machine on the right. You can estimate it with the one on the left with using a rough fudge number. So anyways, that's just a little bit about the logistics of how soil carbon is measured and then analyzed in a lab. We can also have inorganic carbon. So up to this point, I've only been talking about organic carbon because there's more research on management changes and organic carbon. But management changes can result in differences in inorganic carbon too. And some soils can have larger quantities, greater than 5% of inorganic carbon. It's mostly in the form of calcite or calcium carbonate. And these soils are also usually basic and have a pH greater than 7.2. In Iowa, these soils are predominantly in the Des Moines lobe, which I just talked about, and out west in the Luss Hills in section 1 and 7 here. And on the right are a graph of the distribution of soils from several counties, or all the counties around Iowa, and the percentage. It might be hard to see these numbers, But just know that the larger the values are on the graph, the more it's almost like a histogram. The more samples there are that are at that value. And so on the x-axis is a pH range from 4.5 to about 8.5. And so you could see out in the Luss Hills, area 7, there are a lot of soils. There's that peak at 8.5. And then with the Des Moines lobe, we have several soils that are about at 6, a pH of 6, but we have almost equal amount that are out above the pH of 7.5 or so, between 7.5 and 8.5. And we usually measure this inorganic carbon by dissolving the calcite with acid and subtracting it from a total carbon measurement. So by knowing the total carbon and the inorganic carbon and the organic carbon, we can calculate one value from knowing 2 out of the 3 of those. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about research. I've talked about some hypothetical data. I showed some old data on soil pH just to show a little bit about inorganic carbon, and some soils can have high inorganic carbon. Now I'll show you where I have gotten those numbers of about 50% loss since cultivation. So this is from a recent study by a former postdoc of mine, Raganko Day, who's now at Minnesota State Mankato. And part of his study, he compiled 11 studies here that were from around the Midwest and kind of southeastern and South United States, where there was a native grassland and then a land use that had been in cropland for a century or more. And then the studies measured the total carbon stock, and these are in megagrams of carbon per hectare. And there are many different depths measured here. I won't go into that now. I'll come back to that in a moment. But you can see the maroon or cardinal red bar is the native grassland, and then the hatched yellow bars is the cropland. And just to guide your estimate of what percentage the cropland is of the native grassland, I put in the percentage there in each bar. And we have soils ranging from 40%, a low of 40%, the cropland is of the native grassland potential, up to as high as 82% in one study that was in Iowa and Minnesota. Actually, that one happened to be in the Des Moines lobe. And so in order to close that soil organic matter gap or soil carbon gap, I like to start out with the 5 principles of soil health that I borrow from the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And they outline these as the following: soil armor, minimizing disturbance, increasing plant diversity, having a continual live plant root, also called perenniality, or livestock integration. And there are several practices that fall within each of these principles. So, for example, I'm going to list a few, but this isn't a comprehensive list under each one of these principles. So under soil armor, there's cover crops, increasing residue amount, reduced tillage, using CRP or prairie strips. Under minimizing disturbance, reducing tillage, of course, lowering compaction through maybe controlled traffic farming, using CRP or prairie strips. Plant diversity, using cover crop mixtures, extended crop rotations, maybe including a small grain, using intercropping, and CRP or prairie strips. Again, you can see there's a few of these that apply for all the soil health principles so far. For a continual live plant root, one of the hot management practices is using cover crops, and that applies to many of these principles, including this continual live plant root, perennial cover or perennial crops in general, like kernza, or maybe a perennial biomass crop like miscanthus or switchgrass, relay cropping, where you have crops overlapping and no fallow gaps, CRP or prairie strips, all in order to get a longer period of live plant roots covering the soil and cycling nutrients and providing rhizodeposits that increase biological activity. And then finally, livestock integration, where We used to have ruminants grazing the prairie savannas of the Midwest, and there's a lot of interest from growers bringing cattle out to graze cover crops or perhaps seed pastures in a rotation. Pasture crops like alfalfa is gaining some traction these days. And then just adding manure is one way to kind of reintegrate livestock rather than using synthetic fertilizer sources, adding manure as a source. Okay, so if we look at the management practices that fall under here, and these are some data we've compiled from several meta-analyses. So meta-analysis is a study of study, and some of these practices have more than one meta-analysis that has covered them. I just want to point out a few things here in this slide. This is kind of a complex table that I'm happy to share the resource. And I also want to point out that an effort led by Dr. Lisa Schulte-Moore and others in a large group from Iowa State pulled together a more comprehensive version of this table that's a little more fleshed out. We'll have a publication out within a year or two that goes into more details, into a synthesis of these meta-analyses on management practices and increases in soil organic carbon. But the first column is the soil health promoting practice that was under each principle, and then the NRCS soil health principles that are covered under each of those practices. So conservation tillage, crop rotation, CRP or restored prairie, cover crops, adding manure, and biochar. The manure and biochar are interesting because they're more of a sliding scale, not a yes or no practices in place. Usually the more you add, the more benefits you get. But that third column is what I want to draw your attention to, and that's the soil organic carbon change for each of those management practices, a global average. And there's a lot of variability. That number after the plus minus sign is the standard deviation, so the amount of variability around that number. And you can see many of the practices are pretty similar if you look at these, the standard deviation and the means. But they range from about 1/10 of a ton or megagram of carbon per hectare per year, all the way up to about 0.63 for conservation tillage. And then biochar, the meta-analysis didn't use the units in stocks, but they have a percent change, and they found that you could get a potential increase of up to 39%. However, right now biochar is just not economically feasible to put on a large number of acres in the Midwest. The other thing I want to mention, and there are a few other columns on here, just the number of studies included in these meta-analyses, and they range from 30 up to over 200. The more studies you have, theoretically, the more robust the meta-analysis is. And then there's a mean years of the study was conducted. So meaning how long did the researchers measure soil organic carbon? And that ranges from an average of 3 for the biochar up to 23 for the CRP or restored prairie. And so there's a wide range there, important considerations that we need to think about when we're comparing management practices or assigning carbon credits. And the other thing to think about is the mean soil depth reported in all these studies. And so the mean was about 20 to 30 centimeters, or about 1 foot, 3/4 to 1 foot depth. And we might be missing a lot of soil carbon at depth by focusing on the surface. But I'll talk about the issues with that as well. But before I get to those kind of known unknowns, I do want to talk a little bit more about some known knowns, and these are some research I want to highlight, some data I want to highlight from Iowa State, including some from my own group. But before I talk about my research group, I want to talk about a former colleague of mine who's now retired, Dr. Mahdi Al-Casey. He and David Kwamenza, who's still in the agronomy department at Iowa State, conducted a long-term tillage study at 7 sites across Iowa. And these are the 7 sites at the research farms where they were located. They monitored soil carbon over 12 years from 2002 to 2014. They had 5 tillage intensities: moldboard plow, chisel plow, that's what those abbreviations mean, deep rip, a strip till, and then no till. And then they had those 5 tillage intensities implemented on a corn soybean and a corn soybean rotation. And they sampled down to 60 centimeters, or about 2 feet deep, which was deeper on average than most of those other studies that I had just shown in the table. And these are the results that I've acquired from their a table that they provided in that document that I'm happy to provide. They saw that moldboard plow, chisel plow, and deep rip all decreased soil organic carbon over those 12 years from about negative 0.39 megagrams to negative 0.3 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year, whereas the strip till and no-till inversely increase soil carbon by 0.37 to 0.39 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year over the 12-year study. And so that dashed line there in the center is indicating whether or not there's an increase or decrease in soil organic carbon accrual in megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. And what's interesting is that the global increase with no-till, estimated from those meta-analyses that I showed, is about 0.63 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. And what's interesting about that is there are many studies that measure soil carbon after 30, 40 years of no tillage, but they didn't get a baseline sample or where a sample when they began the experiment. Many are comparing each other at the time of sampling. And so if you take that into account, there's about a 0.6 difference between the no-till and strip till and the other 3. So in other words, the treatments that are increasing soil carbon, those are decreasing it, matches about that global increase from no-till. Okay, I want to come back and talk about another practice, and this will be the last in-depth dive. I'll go into these soil health promoting practices. I want to talk a little bit about some work that my graduate student Cole Dutter is working on. And before I do that, I want to talk about some previously published data from CRP, or Conservation Reserve Program. And CRP increases soil organic carbon at about 0.45 tons or megagrams of carbon per hectare in comparison to the no-till increases. And these are those same studies that I showed the soil organic carbon gap between the native grassland and the cropland. So many of those same studies all had a treatment where there was CRP in there too, and these are showing the carbon accrual rates. And you can see a wide variety here or wide range in values from about 0.2 megagrams of carbon per hectare up to over 1. And that highest one, the one that's over 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year, is because those researchers sampled down to 300 centimeters or 3 meters. And or about 10 feet deep. So they had more carbon they could account for. That's one of the benefits of measuring deep carbon, even though it's challenging to measure carbon very deeply, where most of these other studies measured soil carbon between 10 and 15 centimeters, which is about 4 to 6 inches. And you still see a wide variety amongst those other studies that measured more shallow surface depths. But if we look on average across all these studies, there's about a 1/100th of a percentage point, or 0.01% increase in soil organic carbon from the cropland per year too. So that's another way to phrase it rather than the stocks or tons of carbon per hectare. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the work my student did on soils under prairie strips, which is another conservation practice gaining a lot of traction. I'm going to talk about concentration here rather than stocks because that's the data we have right now. And the strips, if you're not familiar with it, is the science-based trials of row crops integrated with prairie strips. And there's many reasons for using these strips. This is a nice photo provided by Omar de Coke Mercado. It shows the goals is to increase pollinator habitat, reduce erosion, provide other wildlife habitat and perhaps other benefits. Usually planting a 10 to 20 foot wide strip of native prairie species, and then farming around that strip. So it kind of acts as a contour strip or a terrace in a field without having to actually create terraces. And right now, this was the current adoption across the Midwest. There's 14 states where there's farmers that are implementing prairie strips with over 14,000 acres of prairie put back as strips on fields, and over 140,000 acres that are protected with a 10% of the land put into strips here. And the reason why prairie rather than just another perennial grass is that one, it is a perennial cover. It has deep roots. We know a lot of native prairie species had very deep roots. They have stiff, erect stems that provide kind of a physical barrier to erosion and runoff. It's diverse and native as well, as shown in the picture here on the right, showing some cone flowers and some black-eyed Susan as well out in the field. And the main idea with the prairie strips is that there's disproportional benefits to these prairie strips, meaning that even though you take out only a 10% of the field to put in place in prairie strips, you get a lot of benefits. And there's been quite a bit of research on this, including the research we're doing in my lab and my graduate student is working on. This is some already published results that I'm happy to provide people a PDF on, work done by Dr. Lisa Schulte-Moore and others. So this is work done at Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, where they had a replicated experiment with watersheds that had no strips in them, shown there with kind of the corn kernel looking watershed with no green strips in it, and then different configurations of strips, including a 10% strip where there's contour strips and a version where there's a little bit thicker strips. And then that strategically adding 10% resulted in a 37% reduction in water runoff, 95% reduction in sediment loss, 77% reduction in phosphorus loss, 70% reduction in nitrogen runoff, 70% reduction in subsurface nitrate concentrations, although not tiled, the fields aren't tiled there, and more than triple the pollinator and double bird abundance as well. The influence on yield was only proportionate to the area taken out of crops. In other words, the prairie strips are not affecting the surrounding crops. Even some preliminary work that my graduate student is working on right now with others is showing that there's no effect on the nearby crops. There's no additional weed problems, and it's cheaper than installing terraces and costs comparable to cover crops. And what my graduate student was looking at was, what about the soils under and around prairie strips? And I'm just going to talk about what happened to the soils under the prairie strips here. And do the soils under the prairie strips follow this 0.01% change in SOC or soil organic matter per year? I'm going to show soil organic matter. And this was in collaboration with the Soil Health Institute. So Cole Dutter is my graduate student shown on the top here. Liz Reiki is the postdoc working at the Soil Health Institute that helped us sample. We sampled 12 years after establishment in the control and then in a prairie stripped watershed in 2019. And we sampled in 3 locations where a strip would have been and 3 locations with an actual strip. And we repeated this in 3 more paired watersheds. And so these are the data in soil organic matter. On the left are the control dots. This is a box plot showing the extent and range of the data. And soil organic matter across all soils is about 3% to just over 4%. But there's about 11% relative increase. In other words, about 0.03% increase in soil organic matter per year. So at a little bit faster clip than the CRP, at least with these preliminary data. We're still looking into that. The other thing I want to mention, and I talked about this at the top of my talk, is the other benefits that come along with soil organic matter or soil carbon. So we also observed that the soils under prairie strips were more stable as measured by something called the SLAKES mobile phone app. This is the stability score and the control and the prairie strip. This time we only have 3 measurements because these are a little bit more intensive measurements. This is the percent stable aggregates with a different method, the sprinkle infiltrometer. And then this is the percent stable aggregates remaining using the wet sieving method. As you'll notice, these all look almost identical. They all point the same direction, that soils under prairie strips are more stable, about 50% more on average. And then the prairie strip soils also increase soil water storage, and they do with a couple different measurements of soil volumetric water content. So using the saturation tray, this is how much water can be held in centimeters cubed per cubic centimeters of dry soil. A gravity table, which is at about -3 kilopascals. And then a tension table, which is at a little bit stronger potential at field capacity, -33 kilopascals. And that ranges from about 4 to 9% increase. So this translates to about a 14% increase in plant available water storage if you look at it with depth that we sampled. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the known unknowns. And the first thing I want to mention is that monitoring soil organic carbon change is challenging. This is one of the things we really need to be wary of. There's a high natural spatial variability, meaning even one field that looks seemingly flat can have a large variation in soil organic carbon, soil organic matter. And the way we handle the soil samples and then do the carbon analyses on those 2 machines I presented earlier add additional error to the measurement. So we need to grab an original baseline or original measurement before the management practice has been started. That's ideal. We also need to know the soil depth and try to sample deep if possible. Bulk density measurements help to get stock, but we know that's can be onerous and maybe even more variable than measuring the soil organic carbon. And then the slow rate of change in organic matter, 0.01% per year for CRP, 0.03% organic matter for prairie strips. And all of those factors add a challenge in trying to see a signal in the noise. And maybe you can see that word signal in that picture up in the upper right. And that's what we're trying to do with verification and monitoring, is trying to find a signal or a management effect of management intervention and increase in soil carbon. And then sometimes statistical and soil science traditions might hinder us. So this is a kind of what's colloquially called the bell curve, and this is what is a normal distribution and what a lot of our statistics are based off of, and can actually hinder us in making recommendations. And I'll show a good example of that. And then the quality of soil organic carbon can change too. So not just quantity, which is what I've been talking about up until this point, but the quality or the chemical nature of it, how biologically available it is, how much soil organic carbon is in the biology. All of these things are important aspects that we may need to be measuring and monitoring as well. We know they're important from a scientific standpoint, but again, we don't know how they might inform carbon markets, which is why it's under this known unknown. And we know that a lot of those measurements, those qualities of soil organic carbon, are actually more sensitive than the total quantity or stocks over time. We also need to be cognizant of co-benefits of increasing soil organic carbon. So these are other benefits that kind of come along for the ride, like increasing water storage that I just showed you with the benefit of strips, the stability of soils, the nutrient storage and delivery to plants. Those are things that we need to be cognizant of, maybe even measuring it on certain sites. And then on the flip side of that, we need to be thinking about trade-offs, especially with increasing soil organic carbon. A colleague of mine, Dr. Stephen Hall, and his group, a grad student of his, published a paper showing that nitrous oxide emissions might actually be offsetting or making up for any gains in soil organic carbon with many management practices. So we need to keep that in mind as well. And some management practices like no tillage might actually increase greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide while maybe increasing soil organic carbon. So those are all things that we know, and they're unknowns in how they're going to be placed in the carbon markets in the future. All right, so I mentioned how I was going to come back to how these statistical traditions might hinder us, and this is where I'm going to ask for some audience participation. So I've got two soils pictured here. These soils were collected just feet apart. They're in a long-term experiment near Boone, Iowa. And one of these soils is from an 11-year restored prairie. The other has been in corn and soybean for greater than a century, we think. So could you tell me which of these is from the 11-year restored prairie? And I'll take a moment for you to look at the soils and try to decide. This would be the point where I normally pass around some actual examples of the soil. Okay, so hopefully you've had some time to figure out which of these is the restored prairie. If you guess the soil on the right, you are correct. And the evidence that should have been evident from just your observation with your eyes is that there are larger aggregates. The aggregates are even a little more jagged and have different shape than the corn soybean soil on the right. They're darker in color actually, and that's not me providing trick lighting or anything. That's actually the true color of these. And if we were in person, you'd be able to tell this just by looking at these with your naked eye. And you notice there were more roots in this soil, I'm sure, as well. And all of those things are visually very evident difference between the restored prairie and the corn soybean. However, this is the kicker, and this is why I think we need to be careful with statistical traditions and soil science traditions for that matter. A paper that came out in 2017 by Renee Dietzel and others at Iowa State showed that even though these two soils were, the prairie was slightly greater in soil carbon content, so 3% carbon on the soil on the right versus 2.6%. Actually, I think these are our values. Their values are in that paper, and they measured it in stocks. There was no difference in soil carbon between this restored prairie after 11 years and the corn soybean. And then the same was found in a paper by Mustafa Ibrahim and Michael Thompson and others in 2018, Dr. Stephen Hall and others, and his postdoc in 2020. And then my student, Teresa Middleton, we also found the same thing. I think that's where the 3%, and she sampled in 2019, and still there was no statistical difference, meaning that out of the 4 replicates, there's a greater than 95% chance that that soil on the right is significantly greater. So I point this out just to be careful with statistical traditions, and sometimes we need to come to our senses, so to speak, and just use our senses to evaluate changes in soil. Although I know the carbon markets aren't going to be paying on subjective use of senses. So now I'll just talk a little bit about the unknown unknowns. These are things that are mostly at the government scale and new technologies that we have no idea how they're going to affect carbon markets. So what I hear from my economist colleagues is that some government involvement is needed to standardize verification and measurements. The term Wild West gets thrown around a lot by my economist colleagues. So we need some carbon market and standardization, some stabilization. The question for scientists is, how good are our soil carbon models? It'd be better to minimize soil sampling and use modeling and maybe some proximal sensors that I'll talk about with the technology, which measure soil carbon without measuring them, so to speak. However, the technology is not there at this time to do that, and we still need to collect samples and analyze them the old-fashioned way that I've talked about in this talk. But in the future, maybe we can rely more on carbon models as the science progresses. And technology needs to change the way we monitor soil organic carbon change, because it is so onerous and difficult. It needs to be fast, inexpensive, and easily applied across the field. And probably we're not going to sample all soils deep. It's great that scientists are doing this in certain locations, and we need to understand deep carbon, but for growers and paying growers for carbon, we just cannot sample all fields very deep and in all locations. So one kind of clever technology is using this mobile phone app called NICS Color Sensor, and it comes with a sensor that analyzes the visible wavelength of a certain color. And these researchers in this paper from 2020 showed that this was a pretty good method to measure soil organic carbon, at least in the types of soils they were looking at. So take-home questions and answers I mentioned I'd come back to. Do we know enough about soil management and soil organic carbon changes to inform carbon markets? Yes, with cautious optimism. Measuring soil organic carbon is challenging, and for all the various reasons I mentioned, but especially for the practices that are based on change in practice rather than an outcome. The meta-analyses or the studies of studies point to many of these management practices do increase soil carbon. We just need to understand where, when, and why, some of the details to kind of reinforce our estimates and models. And where the science should focus to improve these management recommendations in carbon markets, we need to invest in long-term experiments, because these are few and far between. There are several great ones in Iowa and other places in the Midwest, but we need more investment at both the state and federal level. I brought up this question, I'll bring it up again. Do we need to be sampling deep? My opinion is we probably can't do that everywhere, but we need to figure out where and why, and if we can get some funding to sample deeper. Then we need to explore those co-benefits and trade-offs I mentioned, so the benefits that come along with increasing carbon, or the trade-offs with some management practices that actually might hinder some of those soil ecosystem services. Yield being one of those trade-offs actually for some of the management practices. And then 4, we need to develop inexpensive, accessible technologies to measure soil organic carbon change, and that includes modeling. And so I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Crops TV. Again, here's my email, marsh@iastate.edu. You can follow all the research that my lab group is doing at soil_plant_IXNS, which stands for interactions. And I just want to end with this beautiful photo from Dick Sloan's farm near Raleigh, Iowa, showing some glowing corn with a prairie strip running through the middle of the photo here. Thank you.